So Louis Theroux's documentary Inside the Manosphere came out during last week, and I want to talk a little bit about it, both the film itself and also some kind of strange contextual decision both that Louis Theroux himself has made and also that I think we all keep making in our wider conversations about the Manosphere. Let's roll a quick clip from the film just to get us started.
I normally train a little bit earlier in the day. I like to start my day off working out, doing hard things. Who are you talking to? What, do I not talk to them? Don't talk to him. Talk to you.
We're not on social media now.
Probably the best bit of the whole film is that moment where HSTikkyTokky, who is one of the figures that Louis Theroux follows around, just starts talking to the documentary cameras, where they're kind of trying to do more of a fly-on-the-wall kind of thing that the sort of style that Louis Theroux usually does. But I imagine many of you, or most of you that are going to watch this film, will probably have watched it already. And I think my overall review of the film is that it's kind of all right. Right? It's I think if you have been on the internet in the last 10 years, there's probably not a huge amount that is new that you are going to learn here. However, I do think it puts some kind of flavour on the bones of this world. Like, it maybe feels a little bit late in the game, I think, some of which is just the turnaround times of Louis Theroux making a film for Netflix, which, I mean, kind of is part of this whole world, right? Is that they are streaming live and therefore can say things exactly as they happen. I mean, hey, I can make a video, even doing something like this, where there is some editing involved in it. You know, we can make something, probably we have filmed this yesterday and it has come out today, whenever you're watching this. Whereas kind of quote unquote mainstream media takes a lot longer to make stuff because the lead-in times are longer, there's a lot more cost involved, and yes, the final product is slicker, but if you are a HSTikkyTokky or a Sneako, does speed in terms of impact sometimes outweigh beautifully shot documentaries like this? I think some of the conversations that have already started to surround the film will bring to mind a lot of the similar conversations which happened pretty much bang on a year ago surrounding Netflix's adolescence. I believe I'm right in saying that Inside the Manosphere, the Louis Theroux documentary, was in the process of being made prior to adolescence, but it feels like in terms of bringing conversations surrounding this online misogynistic world into the mainstream, that this is like another part of that timeline. And I think that's why I feel that even though if to anyone who has existed on the internet over the past decade, a lot of this stuff doesn't feel particularly like a revelation, I think there is still a lot of good in it existing, right? It is still good that your nan and your granddad can now learn about all of this stuff that is going on, even if it feels less new to a lot of us. And I will say that even within that, it did feel like, maybe in comparison to some of Louis Theroux's other stuff, it did feel like this exists, like this online world exists, was kind of the limit of the film. I will say there were some kind of intriguing moments, you know, one of which being that moment at the very beginning where HSTikkyTokky is kind of just talking to the cameras and sort of doesn't even seem to understand the concept of a documentary in a way that kind of is a bit of a revelation in terms of like what does his media diet consume of. But there are a number of other kind of moments that stood out as being like a little bit revelatory, particularly around these particular figures. There is, for example, a moment, sorry, this is the best screen cap I could find. There's a moment where Louis Theroux's chatting to Myron Gaines of the Fresh and Fit podcast. And Myron Gaines has sort of been given it large, and he's chatting about how he's got all these girlfriends, he's got his partner, who, a wife maybe, I can't remember whether they're actually married yet or not by the time they're doing this, and he's like, yeah, in the future I'm gonna have loads of wives, and then Louis Theroux meets his wife and is like, is he gonna have loads of wives? And she's like, well, I think she sort of like diplomatically says, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, or something, in a way that just like completely undermines this whole idea of like, I control all the women in my life and I get my own way. Actually, that doesn't entirely happen. I think it's also this interview where she talks about him being a different person on camera to off, which kind of undermines some of it. I mean, I don't think that's any kind of defense of Myron Gaines, but I think undercuts the personality a little bit. There's also another intriguing moment where we meet HSTikkyTokky's mum, and you know, she is similarly like, I sort of don't love all this stuff. But then there's another level there where she kind of actually is quite defensive of him, and is sort of happy for it to exist in the world. You know, any repercussions of someone else's problem. And so there are like revealing moments. I don't know if it ever really gets to the bottom of why this exists, and some of the kind of dead ends that it goes down in terms of not managing to do that are what I want to touch upon today. Because one of the things that I think it does accidentally is talks to how mainstream all of this. It really does feel like throughout the documentary that the climax they were hoping to build up to was an interview with Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate gets a few shout outs during the film. There is also this sense in some of the promo for this, Louis Theroux has talked about this being like sort of the final boss of his documentary stuff. I think that's underselling his previous work. I don't think this quite holds a candle to that. And it feels like, you know, the dream version of this was him using his power as Louis Theroux, ex-BBC documentary maker, to gain access to Andrew Tate, something that maybe other people wouldn't have been able to do in quite the same way. Although I will say someone who works for the BBC has previously done interviews with him, so it kind of has been done before. And it might be seen as a bit of a failing that he doesn't bag that interview in the end, but I think actually the fact that he's able to focus on a bunch of other creators who are in this world, that he bumps into kind of fans of them, and you sort of see actually the ways in which you can't pin all of this on one person, like that there is this sort of growing infrastructure of it, some of which is downstream of Andrew Tate in a way that is interesting. There is a chap called, I forget what his name, this chap here, he has got into this world sort of through Andrew Tate's kind of scam investment thing in a way that's kind of really interesting, that there is this kind of like downstream to it all. However, the big moment where Louis Theroux really kind of tries to take a step back and place it in a wider context, the context is almost exclusively about the internet, in a way that I do think is exceptionally perceptive. There's sort of this recognition that, yeah, there is a degree to which a lot of the outrageous things that these people are saying, they are saying for clicks. And then if people start clicking on the stuff, you are incentivized to keep doing that. I do think that is really perceptive. I was looking at the Fresh and Fit page on YouTube, for example, and, you know, everything is fresh and fit versus 5 liberals. Financial depression, ? Storms off screaming. Like, it is very clickbait, and that is something that shapes every aspect of the online world, right? We, in making these clips and in making videos for the main channel, are constantly thinking about like, okay, well, how do we make people want to click this thing? But then how does that balance with the fact that we're trying to do kind of news and current affairs stuff where we need the packaging in terms of title and thumbnail to reflect the actual thing that we're going to show people in some way, and so we can be a bit clickbaity. And often, you know, if the choice is making something a bit clickbaity or no one watching the thing, you know, we are minded that it is for the good of the world, hopefully, if we've done our jobs right and made a good thing, that people watch the thing rather than us being too like top button done up. You know, at the same time, like, often we've interviewed a bunch of people with professional jobs and reputations for a thing who possibly aren't going to want to be in something that has too outrageous of a branding to it. And so there is always this like balance of kind of the better and worst angels of our nature. And I think the context in which Louis Theroux puts this is one in which this is people always succumbing to the worst angels of their nature. I was interested in that, in kind of looking at this as almost a sister documentary to Channel 4 last year, towards the end of last year, oh well, no, July last year, so a long time ago, made a documentary about Bonnie Blue, which again wasn't super insightful. And in fact, one of the things that wasn't super insightful about it was that the film had the title 1000 Men and Me, never really went into the ways in which Bonnie Blue's kind of outrage machine is an outrage machine, and is about making these big claims. In fact, they never really investigate whether she actually did this thing, I won't talk about it too much for monetization reasons, but did this thing that is at the heart of the film. They aren't there for it, and then they never really try to see whether it actually happened. And I think watching that, I was like, oh, Bonnie Blue is just Katie Hopkins, but for pornography. There is this kind of like outrage machine thing. Some of you remember, some of you may not remember Katie Hopkins these days. Katie Hopkins was an ex-apprentice candidate in the UK who is still going, but and characteristically recently was at the Cambridge Union, and the debate was, this house believes in the right to offend. Kind of, she became a political commentator, but really it was all about gaining attention through just saying outrageous things, and gradually, you know, that lent itself to becoming a right-wing commentator because there was more outrageous things to say, and so I think that kind of angle to it is really interesting, right? There are a lot of people that make things for the internet that are very defensive of the internet as a machine for communication, etc. I am not that person. I am someone who is like constantly quite critical of the job that I do and unsold on whether it's good for society. However, it felt quite limited to mostly use that as the model for exploring this, because there is also the much richer theme of misogyny here, and like the ways in which that is also present elsewhere in society, and in which that these figures, whether it's Sneako or this guy or HSTikkyTokky or Andrew Tate, that these figures are an extreme articulation of something that is actually more latent elsewhere in society too. But I think what was particularly characteristic was that where the film did try and dig into what we might more broadly call like the gendered angle of the conversation, it was largely about looking at the fact that many of these men that were featured in the documentary had absent fathers. So HSTikkyTokky's dad was an England rugby player, but wasn't around during his childhood, and it kind of briefly explores that as an angle. I can't think whether it explicitly touches upon sort of this idea that you know, men's status in the world has reduced, but it very much kind of comes at this as this kind of sympathetic angle to why these men who are clearly broken men, like I think you know, if the film does something well, it is to get across that there is a sense of being a little bit broken that is coming through in this. However, I think I'm always really a little bit concerned when we have conversations around the manosphere, we have conversations around these extreme misogynistic figures, in which we sometimes, or very often actually, begin the conversation from a place of deciding that they're probably right a little bit. And so rather than looking at the sense of like broader misogyny that exists elsewhere in society and how that might be encouraging these particularly extreme articulations of that, we actually look for what the grain of salt of truth might be in what they're saying, which I think this is already a part of. But the bigger reflection of that for me was seeing that post making this documentary, Louis Theroux had gone and done an interview with Chris Williamson.
Louis, you've got 3 sons, 20, 18 and 11. Why were you interested in doing this documentary?
Well, for reasons closely related to that. I mean, yeah, that's obviously part of it.
So Chris Williamson is someone who, if you watch the videos over on my main channel, you will have heard of a little bit before. Last year, maybe 2 years ago now, I made a film about birth rates, about the fact that conservatives, both big C but also like small c, like people who are a little bit conservative, we're starting to get really obsessed with birth rates and the decline in birth rates and kind of exploring that. And we looked at some kind of more extreme figures in that, but someone who came up a lot in the conversation around that was Chris Williamson, who had done a bunch of interviews with various figures who are like involved in this debate in some way. Chris Williamson is someone who, and presumably Louis Theroux has also taken this view, would like to think of himself as not in the manosphere. Like, that is sort of part of his branding to an extent. He has some disagreements with Myron Gaines, apparently, I've learned over the last few days, but he is someone who would like to think of himself as not in that world at all. And in fact, this comes up in this conversation between him and Louis Theroux. I'll just play you a little bit of it.
Look, I think it's interesting for me having this conversation because I'm accused of being a part of the manosphere very regularly. I got in trouble at the start of this year, and a lot of I got called, for the first time ever, I got called a luxmaxer. And I realized, when that happened, I realized that luxmaxer had taken the place of this sort of catch-all term for some guy that we don't like and probably has icky beliefs.
I have to say that the use of luxmaxer as a insult, I think you have to be so online. I have not particularly come across that. I've heard the phrase a little bit, like I'm aware of the concept, but the idea of it being used as an insult, I think you are already spending, your screen time is quite high at the point at which you are aggrieved about that as an insult.
Sort of right wing, maybe it would have been like pickup artist or something else. And it's interesting watching your perspective from me as someone who the manosphere has got a huge problem with, and I've never claimed to be a part of it, and we disagree on a lot of things, and the only real alignment that we have is that men watch our content.
So Chris Williamson clearly does not view himself as part of that world. He has some disagreements with some people at the more extreme ends of it. He frames it as being the only thing that is similar in his stuff, and some of these figures that get interviewed during the Louis Theroux documentary is simply that men watch their content. But that's not true in the slightest. That is a lie. That is completely untrue. Having happened to have come across a bunch of his stuff while making that other film, and therefore it just kind of pops up in my feeds quite a lot, he is very much someone who's really interested in masculinity, in a way that is always going to be, we'll maybe come back to this a bit more in a second, but is always going to be adjacent to those more clearly manosphere spaces, right? A real obsession with the concept of masculinity and of men needing to really understand this thing in a way that, we'll come back to in a second, but also in particular, a view of the world in which not only has men's roles within the world changed, but any sort of down peg in the advantages of men is negative, be that there are challenges for men in the world, which is 100% true, but also that those challenges are very often the fault of women explicitly. I found a clip a minute ago, him talking a little bit about the fact it is difficult to date in 2026. Not something I can particularly relate to, I guess, something I'm very glad to be far away from. However, something that, speaking to people of all genders, is clearly something that is true, that is a difficult world to exist in and to navigate. I think it probably always has been, and I think we can kind of exceptionalize the present a little bit. However, his perspective is that it's particularly difficult for men to date, and that is the fault of women. Here's a little clip.
Across movies, media, even mainstream dating advice, women are being subtly conditioned to seek out emotional unavailability and volatility as signs of desirability. And the result is a generation of women confusing conflict with compatibility and drama with depth and brokenness with mystery. Rather than choosing partners based on emotional maturity or shared values or long-term compatibility, many are drawn to conflict, aloofness, and unavailability.
And, you know, to avoid any sort of suggestions that I've just been like looking for bad clips, this was literally just scrolling down his page, seeing a thing called Where Are All the Good Men At?, being intrigued as to what the answer would be, and it instantly turned out to be that it's that it's about how dating is hard and that that's the fault of women for having for being too picky these days, or here it's that they're going for the dark and mysterious men and not the nice guys, which, you know, Chris Williamson maybe would not describe himself as an incel or would not describe himself as in the manosphere. That is a core principle of like the incel view of the world, right? Is that women are going after the chads that they can't entertain, that they can't obtain, and therefore the nice guys who are the stable, good boys that they should be going after are being left out. You know, he might not be going to the extreme levels of that, but the logic of the worldview of his podcast is on the spectrum at the very least. You know, I was thinking back to some of the conversations that I was watching around birth rates, which many of these figures will look at the concept of birth rates and are jumping straight to the idea that it is the fault of women, and he is someone who has fallen into that, intentionally or otherwise. You know, one of the real truths and the real complications of the question around declining birth rates is the fact that, yes, some degree of it is that women have much larger options when it comes to work now. We have encouraged women into the workplace. Women have wanted to go into the workplace and have done so, and therefore the fact that most of the time it is going to be them that is stepping out of work for some time to have a child, that then becomes an even more negative decision, like option, than it may have been previously. And the way that that conversation goes within these spaces, you know, it's not about making shared parental leave more possible. It's not about how can, you know, men step in to make that possible. It's not about creating a world where men feel like they could be homemakers or whatever. It is almost always about either women are too career driven, or if they're looking at that dating stage, it's again that women are too picky. Here's him in an interview with Mads Larsen, who's a kind of real guy that he had to seek out. Like, he's not a particularly well-known commentator or anything, but he is a guy with thoughts about birth rates, which are all about like the economics of dating and about dating narratives in a way that will give you a little bit of ickiness.
How do you know that it's women's standards being too high and not the standard of men decreasing?
Because it's relative. I mean, men are men and women are women. Going out and saying to men, you have to get better. I mean, who would go out and say Somalis need to get better, or people with Down syndrome have to get better? We don't talk like that to groups. We don't.
How dare you say that men need to get better, right? Which to my mind, if you wanted to be like the healthy part of the manosphere doing that would be the thing you would be discussing. But no, it sort of has to be women's fault. And so you can decide where you think the exact borders of like the manosphere and the problematic aspect of that begin and end. And yet there is clearly a spectrum that exists in which this guy is involved, to the point that it feels really odd that Louis Theroux would make this whole documentary and then feel like, oh, this is a sort of useful place to go and participate, right? I would imagine that if the promotional team behind the documentary and behind Louis Theroux himself are switched on enough, it is that they have gone, great, here we can find people who are drifting towards that world a little bit, or are ripe for the picking, right? Because I mean, if you scroll down, you know, the comments are, Andrew Tate is a symptom and outcome of many failures within modern society. He's not the cause or solution. Like, there is this kind of like apologia for these figures. You know, here's another one. Why is it that we never ask the question, what has happened to the women? Ask that question and watch the bomb go off. if the team behind the film and behind Louis Theroux are being clever enough, what they've done is they've recognised that that viewers of Chris Williamson's podcast, listeners to Chris Williamson's podcast, are at the very least people who are like primed to take the next step and end up in that manosphere space. My worry, however, is that so much of the conversation around the manosphere ends in this weird place where we decide that what we don't have are enough kind of positive manosphere figures. This is something that I saw reasonably recently being discussed by Rutger Bregman, who is a writer, a kind of like pop history, pop sociology kind of writer.
A lot of young men today are growing up without good role models. On the far right, they're getting fed guys like Andrew Tate, a scammer and a criminal who pretends that hating women makes you strong and cool or something like that. And on the far left, they're told to look up to people like Luigi Mangione, a so-called revolutionary who murdered his way to relevance.
I will say, I don't know if I've heard a lot of people saying you should like look up to Luigi Mangione as a figure. That feels like just trying to find someone to balance out Tate, but whatever.
Different ideologies, but it's the same disease, emotional immaturity. They act tough, but it's really just insecurity and bottled up anger. When we look for better role models, I think it's telling that we often have to look backwards to the past, to people like Frederick Douglass or Theodore Roosevelt.
This clip goes somewhere that I think is worth sticking with.
Like Aragorn or Luke Skywalker or Simba.
Cringe. I'm just a little bit.
Characters who are strong and kind, brave and gentle. Now, 4 years ago, I became a dad. And when our daughter was born, friends and family gave us all these great books for girls. The messages were strong and clear and inspiring. Girls are smart, girls are brave, girls can change the world. And one of my sisters even gave us a little sign that said, well-behaved women seldom make history. And I love that one in particular. Now, last year we had a son, and I went looking for those same kinds of books, but for boys. Books that say, boys are smart, boys are brave, boys can change the world. And honestly, I'm still looking.
Okay, which isn't true. Like I have to say, like the idea that you can find books for girls that are saying girls are brave, girls are smart, girls can change the world, etc., and you can't find books that do the same for boys is just completely untrue, right? The challenge with so much of this conversation is that that stuff is already inherently present in the culture for boys in a way that, yes, it's Aragorn, right? It's Simba. You've just mentioned a bunch of the stuff. It's the stuff for girls and young women that is around that is stuff that is framed as an intervention into a culture, so feels very specific and targeted in a way that the stuff for boys is kind of just already there in like every action film you've ever seen or every I don't know, cartoon you've seen. Like that stuff is all like the idea that men can be really useful in the world and good people is kind of already there. It's just not framed as an intervention because it's not been made in that context.
It feels like a lot of progressives today are telling boys that being masculine is a problem. In one recent survey, half of all Democrats said it's bad for boys to look up to masculine men. And then we're shocked when they turn to losers like Andrew Tate. At least he's not asking them to be ashamed of who they are.
And so we often come back to this idea that what men need is not only different role models to Andrew Tate or even Chris Williamson or like HSTikkyTokky, but that they need role models that are not Andrew Tate, but are also very masculine, right? And already also kind of really interested in the concept of masculinity. I think that is to kind of miss the extent to which being really obsessed with the concept of masculinity is kind of on that spectrum still, right? That idea that manliness is this very specific thing that we need to be obsessed by and that we need to be thinking about constantly. Like I would look at my life and say there are plenty of aspects of my life that have been deeply informed by a kind of masculine socialization, right? I will probably order a pint rather than a glass of wine. I kind of like projects often that are a little bit technical. I like being on the computer, and I don't play loads of video games, but I quite enjoy video games, right? All of those are things that have been shaped in some way by being a boy, being a man, masculinity, etc. However, they're not things that I constantly think about in terms of some kind of masculine identity, right? I'm aware of that, I'm kind of interested in poking at that sometimes. However, masculinity isn't something that I constantly am obsessing with. And I think the dangers of this idea, which I think is also kind of present here, in this idea that, there can be an aspect of a kind of non-problematic manosphere, is that as soon as you are in that space where you are really obsessing about concepts of masculinity, and particularly ideas of masculinity that are like being associated with strength, and you're starting to bolt specific stuff onto that, I think you are already in the kind of much softer but much kind of more widespread masculinist and misogynist kind of, you're like at that starting point, right? You are at the like really soft version of that later breeds into this much bigger thing. And what I think about often when I'm thinking about people who say there are no good role models for young men, there are no good role models for men in the media, and that's why Andrew Tate thrives, I often think about the many men who are in the media who don't get categorized as role models for men because they just talk about a different thing. The sort of example, I don't know what, I've never listened to this podcast, but this is the one that I always end up thinking about. There's a podcast called Parenting Hell with Josh Widdicombe and Rob Beckett, who are comedians in the UK. I've never listened to it, couldn't tell you whether it's any good. It is, however, two men talking about being dads, right? Talking about a reason, like, which in a certain framework is probably the most masculine thing you can do, right? That's maybe not the value that the kind of value that I placed on it, but like in some frames, that is the most masculine thing that you can do. And yet this wouldn't get framed as them being role models for men, because we've kind of decided that you can only be a role model for men if you are already kind of in that space where you are obsessing over the concept of masculinity. And I don't think you can be in that space unless you are already on a spectrum with the manosphere. So, I mean, I think we can emphasize this idea of role models anyway. I think it feels like trying to like one-shot the problem by inventing the good Andrew Tate. And yet I think the problem is that any kind of good role model for men is not someone who is being a role model for men in a way that they are doing that as a man, right? And that's part of the just difficulty of solving this problem, I think, because I do think that is the appeal to a lot of this content. But to my mind, the way to solve that is actually, how do you reduce that obsession among young men, among men of all ages? How do you reduce that obsession with gendered roles and gendered activities, which do end up placing a huge amount of weight on like stuff you can just enjoy in a way that, yeah, might be informed by gender, might like affirm a certain kind of internal gender for you yourself, but is not having these like weights put upon it, right? How can you go and watch the football in a way that, yeah, maybe tickles certain gender socializations, but is not like obsessed with the idea that you are doing a man thing? Because I think the starting point of so much of this is that broader obsession. I think it's a real shame. Like, I'm aware that my thoughts in this have been a little bit jumbled around, and I think part of that is none of the conversations we're having around the manosphere are really about how is that broader stuff feeding into this, how are the like lighter touch ways in which kind of masculinist and misogynistic ideas sort of bleed through society. We keep starting the conversation from a point of view of these guys must have some kind of point, right? Actually, maybe we do need to do something about the idea that men's position in society has decreased or whatever, rather than actually going, no, it's good that we have more gender equality. How do we tackle the idea that men should have a greater place in society at the root? Thank you very much for watching this slightly rambling, maybe, piece about Theroux. I would suggest going away and watching the documentary. But if you want to watch a bunch more documentaries, can I suggest going to go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, where you can get 50% off an annual plan to Nebula. It will cost you £2.50 a month, which is kind of ridiculously cheap. That is cheaper than a Twitch sub to an individual Twitch streamer. However, you get access to a bunch of exclusive stuff, some of it by me. You can watch my film, Boomers, you can watch that. Some of it is by other people. Bobby Broccoli made a documentary called 17 Pages, which is really fun. There is a film called Scav. There's a show called Amy's Dead End Treehouse. I'm now just naming things that are coming up on the carousel here, but a whole bunch of exclusive content. You will also be supporting me to make these clips and to make mainstream videos over on the main channel as well. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. Thanks so much for your support, and I'll see you in the next one of these.